The restaurant was a study in beige. It was the kind of place that used words like fusion and concept on its menu, a place where the minimalism was so aggressive it felt like a sensory deprivation chamber. The clinking of cutlery was muted, the conversations of other diners a low, reverent hum. For Ilara, whose life was a catalog of tangible things, the brittle scent of aging paper, the specific weight of a bound folio, the satisfying click of a Hollinger box closing, the environment felt thin, unreal. A memory waiting to be misfiled. Across the table, Julian was a stark slash of charcoal gray in the sea of blandness. He hadn't looked at his menu once. His focus, sharp and unblinking, had been on her since they'd sat down. It wasn't the predatory gaze she'd endured on other disastrous dates. It was something else. It was analytical. The look of a jeweler appraising a stone for its flaws. "You're an archivist," he said, stating it as a fact, not a question. Ilara's hands, which had been pleating her napkin into a tight accordion, stilled. "It was on my profile." "It was," he agreed, a smile touching his lips but not his eyes. "But it's also in the way you hold yourself. A certain stillness. A desire to keep everything in its proper place. You don't just catalog artifacts, do you, Ilara? You catalog moments. People. Wounds." A cold prickle moved up her spine. The observation was too precise, too intimate for a stranger. She had always thought of her mind as a vast, silent library, each memory carefully shelved and cross-referenced. Most were public records, accessible and mundane. But there was one wing deep in the bedrock of her consciousness that was sealed. A dark archive, lightless and unvisited. She offered a tight, dismissive smile. "I think you're giving my job description a little too much credit. It's mostly data entry and fighting with the humidity controls." "Is it?" Julian tilted his head. "I think we're in the same business, you and I. We just work on different ends of the process. You preserve what is. I curate what remains." Ilara felt a familiar wall of professional skepticism rise within her. "Curate what remains? What are you, a grief counselor?" "No," he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "Nothing so imprecise. Grief is a symptom, not the disease. The disease is the memory itself. A sliver of the past embedded in the present, festering. I'm the surgeon who removes it." She stared at him. The metaphor was unsettling, but the earnestness in his eyes was what truly unnerved her. He wasn't speaking in abstractions. He believed this. He was either a poet, a madman, or something entirely new. Her mind cycled through possibilities, trying to file him away. Con artist? Performance artist? A member of some new age cult peddling psychological snake oil? "You're saying you, what? Erase memories?" she asked, the words feeling absurd on her tongue. "I don't like the word erase," he corrected gently. "It implies a crude absence, a scorched earth. What I do is more elegant. I isolate the mnemonic chain, the sights, the sounds, the specific emotional resonance, and I unarchive it. I lift it from the matrix of the mind, cleanly. The facts might remain like a footnote in a history book, but the feeling, the weight of it, is gone. The space it occupied becomes quiet." He spoke with the polished, sterile confidence of a tech CEO unveiling a new piece of hardware. This wasn't passion, it was business. Ilara laughed, a short, sharp burst of sound that felt too loud in the beige room. "Right. Of course. And I suppose you have a brochure for this service?" Julian's serene expression didn't falter. "The best demonstrations are practical, not theoretical. You have one, don't you? A memory that doesn't just haunt you. It defines you. A single, perfectly preserved moment of horror that you've built your entire quiet, orderly life around containing. It's the centerpiece of your collection." The blood drained from her face. His words weren't a shot in the dark. They were a perfectly aimed arrow, and it struck the locked door of her dark archive with enough force to make it shudder. He couldn't know. No one could. She had spent 14 years bricking that memory up, plastering over the cracks, ensuring not a single echo could escape. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice a brittle whisper. "Don't you?" His gaze was impossibly deep. "I can feel the gravity of it from here. It has a shape, a texture. It's the reason you meticulously organize the pasts of others, to distract yourself from the chaos of your own. It's the reason you chose a career of silence. Because in the quiet, you can hear it coming. And you've spent your life listening." Every word was a violation. He was walking through the halls of her library, his footsteps echoing in forbidden corridors. The urge to flee was immense, a primal scream in her throat. But her training, her very nature as an archivist, held her fast. When faced with an anomaly, you don't run. You document. You analyze. You're very perceptive, she finally managed, her voice regaining a sliver of its professional composure. It's a good cold reading technique. Vague but evocative. You should take it on stage. For the first time, Julian's smile reached his eyes, and it was a chilling sight. It was the smile of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. "This is not a trick, Ilara," he said softly, his voice a silken thread in the silence between them. "This is a professional courtesy. An offer from one archivist to another." He leaned closer still, the curated world of the restaurant shrinking until it was just the two of them, suspended in a bubble of impossible tension. "Let me help you with your collection," he whispered. "Let me take it. Your worst memory. Let me unarchive it for you. No charge. No obligation. Consider it a demonstration." The proposal hung in the air, monstrous and glittering. An obscenity dressed in the language of salvation. Ilara sat frozen, the carefully constructed shelves of her mind threatening to collapse, the ghost behind the sealed door beginning to rattle its lock. Ilara left the restaurant without another word. She didn't offer an excuse or a polite farewell. One moment she was sitting opposite Julian, trapped in the gravity of his obscene proposal, and the next she was on the pavement, the cool night air a shocking slap to her senses. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating its wings against a cage. She walked, fast and without direction, the click of her heels on the concrete a desperate rhythm counting out her escape. He was a charlatan. A predator. He'd researched her, she decided. A deep dive into her online presence, what little there was, looking for emotional leverage. He'd found some breadcrumb trail leading back to Lily, some digital ghost she'd failed to exorcise, and had constructed his entire, monstrous performance around it. It was the only explanation that allowed the world to remain screwed together properly. Her mind, the orderly archive, clung to this logic like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood. Sleep offered no refuge. It was a shallow, restless sea, and Julian's voice was the current pulling her under, whispering of quiet spaces and curated memories. She woke with the dawn, feeling as though she'd spent the night cataloging razor blades. Work was her sanctuary. The municipal archives was a fortress of fact, a bastion against the kind of ambiguous horror Julian represented. The air inside was cool and smelled of history, a dry, comforting scent of acid-free paper and aging leather. Here, memories weren't weapons. They were artifacts safely contained in gray Hollinger boxes, their power neutralized by time and context. She spent the morning processing a collection of city planning documents from the 1950s, the methodical, tedious work a balm to her frayed nerves. Zoning permits and infrastructure reports were blessedly, profoundly sane. By afternoon, a fragile sense of normalcy had returned. The date felt distant, a bizarre but ultimately harmless encounter. A story to be filed away under anomalous social experiences. To prove it to herself, to seal the memory in its box, she tried to recall the details of the man, to pin him down with facts. Julian, mid-30s, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that was probably expensive. Dark hair. And eyes, she'd have to file his eyes under unsettling. He wore a tie, a silk one. It was... She paused, her hand hovering over a brittle blueprint. The tie. It was a deep, rich burgundy, the color of old wine. She remembered it clearly, the way the knot was perfectly dimpled, how it caught the low light of the restaurant. She focused on the image, a simple mnemonic anchor. And then it happened. It wasn't a slow fading like a normal memory losing its sharpness. It was a sudden, violent edit. The image of the burgundy tie flickered in her mind's eye, like a faulty projection. For a split second it was forest green. Then it wasn't there at all. The space in her memory where the tie should have been became a nauseating, pixelated blur, a void. She reached for the detail and her thoughts slipped right through it. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force the image back. Burgundy. It was burgundy. But the word had become detached from the sensory data. It was just a word, a label on an empty box. She could remember remembering it, but she could no longer access the memory itself. It was the most terrifying sensation she had ever experienced. It was not the gentle erosion of forgetting, it was a surgical excision. A piece of her recall, trivial as it was, had been scooped out, leaving behind a perfectly smooth, perfectly empty hole. Her breath hitched. She stumbled back from her desk, knocking a stack of folders to the floor. The papers scattered, a flurry of chaotic facts. She looked around the silent, ordered archive, and for the first time in her life, it felt fragile. Its walls were no protection at all. The sanctity of the past, the very foundation of her world, had been violated. And the violation wasn't in an old book or a faded photograph. It was inside her head. Driven by a new, frantic energy, she abandoned her work and rushed to her computer. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, clumsy and trembling. If he had researched her, she would research him. She typed his name, Julian Thorne. That was the name he'd given on the app. The search results were a digital desert. There were other Julian Thornes, of course. A dentist in Ohio. A teenage skateboarder from Australia. A history professor who had died in 1987. But there was no one who matched his face, his age, his unnerving profession. There was no sleek, mnemonic editor, no curator of what remains. She tried variations. J. Thorne. Julian T. She searched for his phrases, curated cognition, mnemonic chain. Nothing. A few obscure neuropsychology papers, but nothing connected to a person, a company, a service. He had no professional footprint. No social media. No photographs where he was tagged in the background of someone else's life. In the vast, interconnected archive of the modern world, Julian Thorne did not exist. He was a ghost. A walking, talking void. The blankness of the screen was a perfect mirror for the new, terrifying blankness in her mind. The missing tie wasn't a slip of the mind, it was a calling card. It was a signature left at the scene of the crime. He hadn't just made an offer. He had, in some small, impossible way, already given her the demonstration. The seed of impossibility, planted in the sterile beige of the restaurant, was now germinating in the fertile darkness of her fear, sending cold, sharp roots deep into the foundations of her sanity. The apartment was silent, but for Alara, the quiet was no longer a comfort. It had become a canvas. The memory glitch, that tiny surgical void, had destabilized something deep within her. The carefully constructed walls of her mental archive, the ones that kept her most dangerous record under lock and key, were beginning to crumble. All it took was the sound of rain against the window pane. A soft, percussive tapping. Just like that night. The memory didn't creep in, it detonated. One moment she was standing in her living room, a ghost in her own life, and the next she was 17 again, gripping the worn plastic steering wheel of her mother's Ford Escort. The world outside was a watercolor wash of streaming headlights and slick black asphalt. The wipers swished a frantic, hypnotic rhythm, barely keeping up with the downpour. Inside, the car was an island of warmth and noise. The radio was playing some forgettable pop song, and the air smelled of wet coats and the cherry air freshener dangling from the rearview mirror. In the passenger seat, Lily was a whirlwind of righteous indignation. "It's not fair, Alara. You always get to be the one in charge." She was 14, all sharp angles and burgeoning rebellion, her voice cracking with the injustice of it all. The argument was monumental to her and laughably trivial in hindsight. Curfew. Alara, the newly licensed and deeply responsible older sister, was a proxy for their parents' authority. "I'm not in charge," Alara said, her eyes fixed on the road. "I'm the one driving. Mom said be home by 10. It's 9:50. 10 minutes? We could have stayed for 10 more minutes. Michael was about to ask me to dance." Lily's face was illuminated in a brief flash of passing headlights, her expression a perfect storm of adolescent tragedy. "You've ruined my life. My life will be ruined if I get a speeding ticket or wrap this car around a telephone pole," Alara muttered, her knuckles white on the wheel. "Just relax." "I can't relax. You treat me like a child. You are a child." It was the wrong thing to say. The final, stupid, thoughtless spark. "I hate you," Lily seethed, the words striking with practiced cruelty. And that's when Alara broke the cardinal rule. For 1 second, one fatal, unforgivable second, she took her eyes off the road. She turned to her sister, a sharp retort on her lips, ready to escalate their meaningless war. In that single second, the world ended. She never saw the other car run the stop sign. Her first warning was a sound, a horrifying, guttural screech of tires that wasn't her own. Then light. Blinding, white, alien headlights flooding the cabin, erasing everything. There was no time to scream, no time to brace. There was only the impact, a deafening, cataclysmic roar of metal tearing and glass exploding. The sensation was one of pure violence. The car spun, a toy in the hands of a furious god. Alara was thrown against her seatbelt, the strap biting deep into her shoulder and chest, the force of it knocking the air from her lungs. A spiderweb of cracks erupted across the windshield, and then it dissolved into a million glittering cubes. The world became a chaotic, tumbling kaleidoscope of rain and light and sound. And then silence. A profound, ringing silence that was somehow louder than the crash itself. Pain was a distant signal, a faint buzzing from somewhere in her arm and head. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the figure in the seat beside her. The cherry air freshener was still swaying gently. The pop song had been cut off mid-chorus. Lily? Alara's voice was a choked, dusty thing. There was no answer. She turned her head, a slow, agonizing movement. Her vision was blurred, dotted with black spots. But she saw. Lily was slumped against the passenger door, her head at an angle that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The vibrant, furious energy of a moment ago was gone, replaced by a stillness that was absolute. Rain and glass glittered in her hair like cruel diamonds. A thin, dark line of blood traced a path from her temple. Her favorite silver bracelet, a charm of a tiny, smiling moon, was broken, the chain dangling from her limp wrist. Time ceased to be linear. It became a loop. The headlights, the sound, the silence. Lily's broken bracelet. Alara's mind, the nascent archivist, recorded every detail with perfect, horrifying fidelity. This was the moment that would become the cornerstone of her entire existence. The hinge upon which her life had turned. The smell of gasoline. The approaching wail of sirens. The face of a paramedic peering in through the shattered window, his mouth moving but forming no words she could understand. All of it was background noise. The only reality was the silent, still girl in the passenger seat. The 1 second she had looked away had stretched into an eternity of consequence. The flashback released its grip, and Alara found herself on the floor of her apartment, knees pulled to her chest, the rain still tapping at the glass. She was shaking, a deep, cellular tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. The memory wasn't a file to be stored. It was a living entity. A parasite that had burrowed into her soul, feeding on her waking thoughts and poisoning her dreams. Every quiet moment was an invitation for it to play its terrible, high-fidelity recording. And Julian's voice, a cold whisper of logic in the storm of her grief, echoed in the room. I can lift it from the matrix of the mind. The space it occupied becomes quiet. The offer was no longer just monstrous. It was a siren's song. The promise of a quiet space, a life without this constant, crushing weight. It was the most tempting, beautiful, and terrifying thing she had ever imagined. For 2 days, Alara existed in a state of suspended animation. She went to work, she ate, she answered emails, but none of it registered. Her entire consciousness was focused inward, on the war being waged within the walls of her own mind. On one side was the archivist, the guardian of history, screaming that every memory, no matter how painful, was sacred and irreplaceable. On the other was the 17-year-old girl, still trapped in the wreckage, whispering that some histories were better off burned. The girl won. Desperation was a key that could unlock any door. She found the business card tucked into the pocket of the coat she'd worn on the date. It was a simple, impossibly elegant piece of black cardstock, heavier than it looked. Embossed on it, in a stark sans-serif font, was a name, Julian Thorne, and a single 10-digit number. No title, no company, no address. An island of information connected to nothing. Her hand trembled as she dialed. It rang only once. I knew you'd call, Julian's voice said, calm and smooth as polished marble. There was no surprise, no triumph. Just a simple, unnerving statement of fact. He didn't have an office. He instructed her to meet him at a specific address in the industrial district, a part of the city defined by featureless warehouses and empty streets. The building was a modern cube of concrete and darkened glass, a recording studio that rented its rooms out by the hour. The anonymity of it was more unsettling than any back alley would have been. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a sterile, premeditated procedure. He was waiting for her in the lobby, looking as out of place as a surgeon in a slaughterhouse. He led her without a word down a corridor lined with sound-dampening foam to a room at the very end. It was an anechoic chamber, a room designed to absorb all sound. The walls and ceiling were covered in geometric foam wedges, creating a bizarre, alien landscape that seemed to swallow the light. In the center sat a single, comfortable-looking leather chair. When the heavy vault-like door clicked shut behind them, a profound silence descended. It was a physical presence, pressing in on her eardrums, amplifying the sound of her own frantic pulse. A neutral space, Julian said, his voice unnervingly clear in the dead air. Memory is tied to sensory input. To do this cleanly, we must first remove the context of the world. He gestured to the chair. Please, get comfortable. Ilara sat, her body rigid with a mixture of terror and hope. Julian remained standing, observing her with that same unnerving, analytical gaze. "The terms remain the same," he stated. "This is a demonstration. A proof of concept. We will not be touching the memory of your sister. That archive is too foundational, its removal too complex for a first attempt. You must choose something else. A memory with a strong negative emotional signature, but one whose absence will not destabilize the entire system. A painful island, not a continent." Ilara's mind raced. What could she offer up? What piece of herself was she willing to sacrifice? She thought of heartbreaks, of failures, of petty cruelties. Then one memory presented itself, sharp and distinct. A professional humiliation. It was perfect, self-contained, potent, and utterly hers. 2 years ago, she began, her voice a dry rasp. "I was responsible for cataloging the estate of a prominent local historian. I was careless. I mislabeled an entire series of journals. For 3 months, researchers were citing documents that were completely wrong. When the error was discovered, the shame was acute. It almost cost me my job. I still can't look my supervisor in the eye without feeling it." Julian nodded slowly. "Excellent. The emotional signature is clear. Humiliation, shame, professional terror. A potent combination. Now I want you to close your eyes. Access the file. Bring the memory forward. Don't just remember it, relive it. See the room, smell the archives, feel the weight of your supervisor's disappointment." Ilara did as she was told. The memory bloomed behind her eyelids with agonizing clarity. The sterile light of the reading room. The accusing silence of her colleagues. The way her supervisor, a kind man named Mr. Albright, had looked at her not with anger, but with a profound, corrosive disappointment that had felt infinitely worse. The shame was a physical sensation, a hot flush that spread from her chest to her face. Just as the feeling reached its peak, it began. A low, resonant hum. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a frequency so low she felt it in her teeth, in the bones of her skull. It was deeply disorienting, and the sharp edges of the memory began to soften and blur. "You are not the memory," Julian's voice cut through the hum, calm and commanding. "You are the archivist. And this is merely a damaged artifact. Observe it. What is the texture of the shame?" "What?" Ilara's eyes fluttered open. "Close them," he commanded. "Answer the question. Is it rough like sandpaper? Or is it slick like oil?" Rough," she stammered, confused. "Good. And the humiliation? What color is it?" It doesn't have a color." "Everything has a color," he insisted, his voice unwavering. "Look closer. Is it a dirty, washed-out gray? A sickly yellow?" "Gray," she whispered, her own thoughts becoming tangled and strange. The humming intensified slightly. "You see?" Julian's voice was close to her ear now. "You are separating the components. The facts of the event are the paper. The emotion is merely the ink that has bled onto it. The ink is the poison. The two are not inseparable. The feeling is a parasite, attached to the memory of the event. Look at it. See the shame, the humiliation as a separate entity. A gray, rough object clinging to the facts." Guided by his bizarre, hypnotic words and the vibrating hum, an impossible image formed in her mind. She could see the memory of Mr. Albright's face, and attached to it, like a cancerous growth, was a formless, pulsating mass of rough, gray energy. The feeling. "You are the archivist," Julian whispered. "You have the authority. This artifact is corrupted. It does not belong in your collection. You have my permission to deaccession it." The hum reached a new pitch, vibrating through her entire being. "Let it go, Ilara," he said, his voice a final, firm command. "Unarchive it. Now." A strange sense of detachment washed over her. She looked at the ugly, gray mass in her mind and felt nothing. It was foreign. It wasn't her. With a mental effort that felt like releasing a breath she'd been holding for 2 years, she let it fall away. It dissolved into the humming darkness and was gone. The hum stopped. The silence of the room rushed back in absolute. Ilara opened her eyes. The world seemed sharper, brighter. She felt light, hollow. "Now," Julian said, watching her intently, "remember the incident. Tell me about Mr. Albright's disappointment." She reached for the memory, and found a void. She could recall the facts. She knew intellectually that she had mislabeled the journals. She knew the error had been discovered. She knew her supervisor had spoken to her. But the feeling, the hot, searing shame, the cringe-inducing humiliation, The memory of her own stuttered apologies was gone. A clean, surgical blankness had taken its place. When she thought of Mr. Albright's face, she felt nothing at all. It had worked. She stared at Julian, her heart a block of ice in her chest. He hadn't just manipulated her. He hadn't hypnotized her. He had done exactly what he'd promised. He had reached into her soul and plucked a piece of it out. The monster was real. And he had just performed a terrible, wonderful, unforgivable miracle. Leaving the soundproofed room was like being born into a world of overwhelming noise. Every sound was sharp, abrasive, the distant groan of traffic, the hum of a fluorescent light in the hallway, the soft scuff of her own shoes on the linoleum. Julian walked her to the lobby, his demeanor that of a clinician dismissing a patient after a routine procedure. "Go live with the quiet for a few days," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "See how it fits." He offered no warnings, no instructions for aftercare. He simply held the door open for her, a silent sentinel ushering her back into a world that was no longer quite the same. For the first 12 hours, the quiet was intoxicating. The constant, low-grade background radiation of that particular shame was gone, and its absence was a profound relief. It was like she had been living with a stone in her shoe for 2 years and had only just now been allowed to take it off. She slept deeply for the first time since the date, a dreamless, peaceful blackness. She woke feeling lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The miracle held. The first crack in that miracle appeared, fittingly, in the archive. She saw Mr. Albright by the microfilm readers. Normally, an unexpected encounter like this would trigger a whole cascade of autonomic responses. A tightening in her chest, a flush of heat to her face, a desperate urge to turn and walk the other way. Today there was nothing. A perfect, serene blank. He looked up and saw her, and his face broke into the kind, forgiving smile she had once found so unbearable because of the guilt it produced. "Alara, good morning. Did you manage to find those council meeting minutes from the 60s? "Yes, they're on your desk," she replied, her voice even and calm. The exchange was normal, professional, and utterly alien. She was performing a role from a script she no longer had access to. She knew, factually, that this was the man whose trust she had betrayed and who had graciously given her a second chance. But the emotional resonance of that history was gone. He was just a man. A colleague. The complex, painful tapestry of their shared past had been reduced to a handful of sterile data points. She felt a profound and unsettling sense of detachment, as if she were a stranger observing her own life from a great distance. Later that day, a colleague, Ben, stopped by her desk. "Hey, try not to catalog any priceless historical artifacts into the fiction section today," he quipped, a friendly grin on his face. It was the standard office joke, the gentle ribbing that had followed her for 2 years. It used to make her stomach clench. She looked at him, and for a second she felt nothing but confusion. The joke didn't land because the premise it was built on, her deep, lingering humiliation, no longer existed in her emotional vocabulary. She forced a laugh. The sound was a brittle imitation, hollow and unconvincing. "I'll do my best," she said. Ben's grin faltered. He gave her a strange, searching look, as if she'd responded in a foreign language. He mumbled something about coffee and quickly walked away. The invisible thread of their shared social history had snapped. The blank space wasn't just inside her. It was creating a barrier between her and everyone else. She was becoming an island. That night, alone in her apartment, the true nature of the void began to reveal itself. The euphoria of relief had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. The quiet Julian had promised wasn't peace, was a vacuum. She tried to probe the edges of it in her mind. The memory of the journal incident had been a node, connected to so many other parts of her. It was connected to her subsequent professional diligence, a constant reminder to be meticulous. It was connected to her sense of humility, her understanding that she was fallible. It was connected to her gratitude towards Mr. Albright. All of those pathways now led to a dead end. A 404 error in the archive of her soul. Her professional diligence now felt unmotivated. Her humility was shallower. Her gratitude was an abstract concept, not a felt emotion. He hadn't just removed the bad feeling. He had removed its function, its purpose in the complex ecosystem of her personality. He hadn't removed a stain. He had cut a hole in the cloth. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her own reflection. The same face looked back, the same dark hair and tired eyes. But the person behind those eyes was different. That person in the mirror had lived through a profound humiliation, had carried its weight and had been shaped by it. She, the person looking, had not. The continuity of her own identity had been broken. The blank space was not a healed wound. It was a new wound, a clean, perfectly circular and terrifyingly deep one. It was a patch of psychic silence in the vibrant noise of her being. And in that silence she felt a terrible, rising dread. A vacuum, after all, exists only to be filled. And she was suddenly terrified of what, exactly, might be drawn to that perfect, empty space inside her. The quiet did not last. Within a week, the serene, sterile void in Alara's mind began to develop an echo. The initial horror of the blank space gave way to something far more active, far more sinister. The psychic wound, clean and precise, was beginning to fester. It started at the edges. Her memory, once her fortress, her perfectly organized archive, began to fray. A cherished memory of a childhood trip to the seaside, once vibrant with the smell of salt and the cry of gulls, now seemed faded, a photograph left too long in the sun. The details of a conversation she'd had yesterday were slippery, hard to grasp. It was as if the void was a tiny black hole, its gravity slowly but surely pulling at the surrounding memories, leaching them of their color, their texture, their life. Then came the temporal distortions. She would be walking down a street she'd never been on before and be hit by a wave of déjà vu so powerful it buckled her knees, a suffocating certainty that she had lived this exact moment before. The opposite was worse. She'd stand in the doorway of her own apartment, a space she had occupied for 5 years, and be struck by a profound and dizzying wave of jamais vu. The familiar angles of her furniture, the specific pattern of light from the window, all of it would suddenly seem alien, hostile, the set of a stranger's life. Her internal timeline was becoming unspooled. The world itself started to glitch. At first, it was subtle, easily dismissed as fatigue. An afterimage of a street lamp that burned in her vision for a second too long. A shadow in her peripheral vision that seemed to twitch with its own volition. She would see a brief, heat-hazed distortion in the reflection of a shop window, a momentary warping of reality that vanished the instant she focused on it. Her brain, she told herself, was simply tired, stressed. But the glitches grew more specific, more personal. They were echoes from the memories she'd had removed, bits of corrupted data floating free. One afternoon, while carefully placing a fragile 19th century daguerreotype into an archival sleeve, she was suddenly washed over by a wave of pure, undiluted humiliation. It was so intense, so crippling that she nearly dropped the photograph. Her face burned, her stomach clenched, but there was no thought attached to it. It was a phantom emotion, a ghost of a feeling haunting the halls of her mind, looking for its source. She began to hear things. A faint, distorted whisper of Mr. Albright's voice, not angry but disappointed, when she was alone in her apartment. The sound would be gone in an instant, leaving her frozen, listening to the frantic beating of her own heart in the ringing silence. The sensory fragments were pieces of the memory Julian had supposedly unarchived. But they hadn't been deleted. They had just been untethered. Broken loose from their factual anchor and left to drift through the currents of her consciousness. It was this realization that brought with it the deepest horror of all. He hadn't destroyed the memory. He had consumed it. The image bloomed in her mind with sickening clarity. Julian, sitting in some sterile room, replaying the vintage of her 2-year-old shame. Savoring its unique flavor, its complex notes of regret and professional terror. He hadn't been a surgeon excising a tumor. He had been a parasite, carefully extracting a particularly rich source of nourishment. The psychic energy, the pure, potent emotion, it had to go somewhere. He hadn't disposed of it. He had feasted on it. This truth recontextualized everything. His calm demeanor, his clinical language, it was all the refined, detached manner of a connoisseur discussing his collection. She hadn't been his patient. She had been his vintage. The final illusion of control shattered. She wasn't a client who had engaged a strange service. She was a victim who had willingly invited a predator into the most intimate, vulnerable part of herself. And he had left the door open. That night, she worked late, the archive her only refuge from the growing chaos in her head. The silence of the stacks was a thin blanket, but it was better than the silence of her apartment. As she powered down her computer, her reflection stared back at her from the dark screen. For a horrifying, split second, the face in the monitor was not her own. It was still her features, her hair, her eyes, her mouth, but the expression was a grotesque mask of pure, distilled shame. The face was contorted in a silent scream of humiliation, an agony untethered from any event. It was the raw emotion she had paid him to take, now wearing her face, looking back at her from the other side of a dark mirror. The void wasn't empty. It wasn't a blank space at all. It was a doorway. and something had just looked through. The reflection in the dark screen, that silent, screaming mask of her own face twisted by an emotion she no longer owned, was a declaration of war. The fear didn't vanish, but it crystallized. It transformed from a paralyzing fog into a single sharp point of ice in her gut. The victim was gone, and in her place stood the archivist. Her own mind was no longer a reliable source. It was a compromised document, its text corrupted, its pages torn. So she turned to the only archive she could still trust, the vast, chaotic, but ultimately factual memory of the world. She would not fight this entity in the surreal landscape of the psyche. She would hunt him in the domain of public records, data trails, and the quiet, forgotten footnotes of other people's pain. The hunt began not with his name, but with his methodology. Julian Thorne was a ghost, a name written on a disposable piece of cardstock. His true signature wasn't a name, it was the unique, surgical wound he left behind in his victims. Ilara sat at her personal laptop, the familiar glow a small circle of light in her dark apartment. Her fingers, trained to navigate the most obscure digital collections, flew across the keyboard. She bypassed conventional search engines, diving deep into university research databases, digitized court records, and the searchable archives of local newspapers across the country. She didn't search for a perpetrator. She searched for the crime. Her search terms were a litany of her own waking nightmare: sudden emotional dissociation, acute memory loss without trauma, unexplained jamais vu, phantom emotions, psychic void. The initial results were a deluge of human misery. Thousands of articles on PTSD, dementia, dissociative disorders, and schizophrenia. It was a haystack of legitimate, diagnosable pain. Finding Julian's needle would be impossible if she didn't refine the search. She needed to look for the anomalies, the outliers that doctors had struggled to classify, the cases that had been dismissed. She narrowed her focus, cross-referencing her keywords with terms like hysteria, delusional, unsubstantiated, and psychosomatic. She was looking for the people who hadn't been believed. 4 hours she found nothing but dead ends. Then a single hit, buried in the online archive of a small regional newspaper from Portland, Oregon, dated 5 years ago. The headline was dismissive, grieving mother's bizarre claim. The article detailed the story of a woman named Sarah Pike, who, after the tragic death of her young son, had begun telling police that a man she met in a support group had stolen her grief. Ilara's blood ran cold. She read on, her heart hammering. The woman's quotes were chillingly familiar. "It's not that I don't remember my son," Pike had told the reporter. "I just can't feel him anymore. There's a quiet space where the love should be. It's a clean, terrible hollowness." The reporter treated her as a tragic curiosity, a mind broken by loss. She was later involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility. A quiet space. It was his phrase. This was it. Her first data point. Ilara's mind kicked into high gear. She now had a location and a time frame. She pivoted her entire search, focusing all her tools on Portland, Oregon, during a 6-month window surrounding the article's publication. She dove into the city's public records. Police reports, psychiatric intake forms, University Health Service logs. She sifted through hundreds of cases, her eyes burning from the screen's glare. She was looking for the same pattern. A sudden, inexplicable psychological break, characterized by the absence of emotion, not the presence of it. She found another one. A police report filed by the wife of a man named Marcus Thorne, the surname a cruel, mocking coincidence. Marcus, a notoriously aggressive litigator, had walked out of his office one day and simply stopped. He told the responding officer in a calm, flat voice that a man he'd hired for cognitive restructuring had removed his anger. He was now incapable of feeling aggression, ambition, or conflict. His career was over. His case was closed, logged as a probable psychotic break. Then a third. A transcript from a university disciplinary hearing. A brilliant music conservatory student, accused of plagiarism, explaining her actions with a disturbing apathy. "I don't remember why I wanted to be a musician," she'd said. "The ambition is gone. I know I had it. There's a record of it. But I can't feel the drive anymore." She was expelled. 3 victims. Sarah Pike, Marcus Thorne, the unnamed student. All in the same city within months of each other. All describing a surgical removal of a core emotion or drive. All of them professionally, socially, or personally destroyed by the cure. Ilara knew she wouldn't find Julian's name. He was too meticulous, a ghost in the machine. But he had to operate in the physical world. She searched commercial real estate archives for short-term leases on discrete, high-end office spaces in Portland during that period. She found one paid for by a shell corporation with a nonsensical name. The corporation was registered in Delaware and had been dissolved the day the lease ended. It was a perfect professional dead end. A ghost's footprint. She leaned back in her chair, the first glimmer of something other than fear dawning in her. It was the grim, satisfying thrill of an archivist who has found a pattern in the chaos. On her screen, she opened a map of the country. She placed a pin on her own city. Then she placed one on Portland. A line connected them, a thin thread of psychic devastation stretching across the miles. She hadn't found the monster, but she had found his trail. A trail paved with hollowed-out souls and broken minds. The hunt was no longer a desperate reaction. It was a methodical, obsessive quest. But as another wave of phantom shame washed over her, cold and sour, she was acutely aware of the clock. She wasn't just the hunter. With every glitch and flicker in the archive of her own mind, she knew she was also becoming the next pin on the map. The digital trail had gone cold, a series of dead-end shell corporations and ghost identities. For days, Elara felt a rising tide of despair. She had a map of Julian's destruction, but the monster himself remained a ghost. Her own symptoms were worsening. The peripheral flickers were becoming more defined, the phantom emotions more frequent. Time was running out. The breakthrough came from an object, not a byte of data. It was the business card. In a fit of frustrated obsession, she was examining it under the high-powered desk lamp in her office, a tool she normally used for analyzing watermarks and paper composition. There was something about the card that had always felt wrong. It was too heavy, its edges too sharp for cardstock. Under the intense light and magnification, she saw it. Not a watermark, but a faint, impossibly precise grid of metallic thread, woven deep inside the polymer layers. It wasn't a card. It was a piece of technology. On a desperate hunch, she took it to a contact in the university's conservation lab, a man whose obsessive knowledge of material science was legendary. She claimed it was part of an art piece she was archiving. He placed it under a spectroscopic analyzer. "This is not paper," he said after a few moments, his eyes wide with academic curiosity. "It's a proprietary polymer composite. And fascinating. There's a passive RFID tag embedded in the substrate. Extremely sophisticated. Military grade almost. It doesn't transmit, it just responds. It's a key, not a tracker." A key. The word electrified her. A key implies a lock. It took another day of calling in favors, but she eventually found a specialist who could build a scanner capable of pinging the tag and triangulating its corresponding receiver. The signal was faint but unmistakable. It led her not to an office or an apartment, but to a place of profound anonymity, a monument to the unremembered. A high-end, climate-controlled self-storage facility on the outskirts of the city. A place where people kept the parts of their lives they wanted to preserve, but not to live with. It was perfect. Gaining access was terrifyingly simple. She posed as a prospective client, her story of a delicate family archive needing storage plausible and well-rehearsed. Once inside the sterile, climate-controlled corridors, she used the scanner, a small device hidden in her palm. The signal grew stronger, leading her down a long, white hallway of identical, featureless steel doors. It stopped at Unit 237. The lock was biometric. A dead end. But as she stood there, heart pounding, a man came to access the unit opposite hers. With his back turned, moving a dolly of boxes, Elara, her hands shaking, placed a small, powerful magnet over the electronic lock mechanism of Unit 237. A trick she'd read about, a way to disrupt the circuitry. There was a faint click. A tiny green light on the lock flickered and died. She held her breath and pulled the heavy steel door. It slid open with a soft, hydraulic hiss. The interior was not a storage unit. It was a shrine. The space was a perfect white cube, lit by cold, recessed gallery lights. There was no dust, no clutter of boxes. Instead, the room was laid out like a minimalist art exhibition. In the center and along the walls stood a dozen pristine white pedestals of varying heights. On top of each pedestal, illuminated by its own dedicated spotlight, sat a single, mundane object. There was a child's worn-out sneaker, the laces frayed. A tarnished silver locket, dented on one side. A chipped ceramic coffee mug with a faded corporate logo. A single, brittle pressed flower under a small glass dome. A broken metronome, its needle frozen mid-swing. Elara stepped inside, the heavy door sliding shut behind her, plunging the corridor outside into darkness. A cold, unnatural stillness filled the air, the same dead silence from the anechoic chamber. A low hum of something seemed to emanate from the objects themselves, a psychic resonance that made her teeth ache. She was drawn to the chipped coffee mug. It pulsed with a familiar energy, a sour note of despair that resonated with a distant part of her. It was the same despair that Marcus Thorne, the hollowed-out lawyer from Portland, must have felt. Compelled by an instinct older than reason, she reached out her hand. The air around the mug was frigid. Her fingers trembled as they brushed against the cool, smooth ceramic. The moment she made contact, the world dissolved. She was flooded. It wasn't a thought or an image, it was a total sensory immersion. She felt the rough texture of a leather briefcase in a hand that was not her own. She tasted the bitter coffee and bile of a sleepless night. She saw a corner office with a panoramic view of a city that wasn't hers. And she felt it, a vast, yawning cavern where a lifetime of ambition and aggression used to be. A profound, terrifying confusion. The desperate, silent scream of a man who looks in the mirror and sees only the shell of himself, the engine of his soul stolen from its chassis. She ripped her hand back as if burned, stumbling away from the pedestal, gasping for air. The vision vanished, but the ghost of the emotion clung to her. She looked at the other objects with new, horrified eyes. The tiny sneaker. It wasn't just an object. It radiated a grief so pure and so immense it was suffocating. Sarah Pike's grief, preserved and curated. The broken metronome hummed with the ghost of a musician's frustrated ambition. The locket resonated with a love that had been betrayed and then excised. This wasn't a storage unit. It was his library, his gallery, his archive of stolen souls. He didn't just consume the memories. He preserved them, stored them in these mnemonic anchors, these phylacteries of pain. He was a collector, a connoisseur of perfectly distilled human trauma, displayed for his own private viewing. As the monstrous reality of the collection settled upon her, a sharp, metallic beep echoed from the hallway. The sound of a keypad. A code being entered. Someone was coming. Ilara froze, her blood turning to ice. She was trapped. A living exhibit locked inside the archive of the dead. The beep of the keypad was a death knell. Ilara's blood turned to slush in her veins. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The room was a pristine white cube, a minimalist stage with no curtains. Her only option was a shallow alcove behind the largest pedestal, one that held a rusted antique birdcage. She squeezed herself into the corner, pressing her back against the cold concrete, trying to will herself into invisibility. She held her breath until her lungs burned. The heavy door hissed open. Julian stepped inside. He didn't seem alarmed or suspicious. He moved with a languid, proprietary grace, like a man entering his own living room. The door slid shut behind him, and the gallery lights seemed to brighten, casting the objects in a sharp, reverent glow. He was humming softly, a tuneless, contented sound that was more terrifying than any scream. Ilara watched, frozen from the shadows. He wasn't here to store or retrieve anything. He was here to admire his collection. He walked first to the child's sneaker, running a single gentle finger along its worn rubber toe. He closed his eyes and a faint, almost beatific smile touched his lips. He stood like that for a full minute, utterly still, and Ilara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was experiencing the pure, distilled grief of a mother, savoring it like a fine wine. He was getting high on Sarah Pike's pain. As he moved through the room, from one object to the next, the psychic pressure in the air became unbearable. Each artifact emanated its own silent scream, a specific frequency of trauma. The room was a symphony of silent agony, and Ilara, her own mind already wounded and unstable, was caught in the center of the cacophony. The combined despair, anger, grief, and fear of a dozen stolen souls beat against her psychic defenses, seeking the weakest point. They found it. The blank space. The perfect, unnatural void he had carved into her. The wound, which had been festering for weeks, was now ripped wide open by the sheer psychic force in the room. And through that opening, her own monster came surging forth. The memory of the accident, the foundational trauma of her life, erupted in her mind. But it wasn't the memory she knew. It was a corrupted file, a grotesque and malignant version. The sound of the rain against the windshield was no longer a soft tapping, but the sharp, frantic scratching of claws. The pop song on the radio warped, its melody twisting into a discordant, demonic dirge. The air in the car no longer smelled of wet coats, but of damp earth, of the grave. And Lily. In her mind's eye, Ilara turned to the passenger seat. But the sister who turned to face her was a horrifying effigy. Her skin was pale, tinged with a bluish, bruised color. Her eyes were not the vibrant, angry eyes of a 14-year-old girl, but dark, accusing pits, empty of everything but a cold, ancient blame. When she spoke, her voice was not her own. It was a dry, dead whisper that cut through the psychic storm in the room and pierced the very center of Ilara's soul. "You did this, Ilara," the ghost of her sister hissed, the words forming not in the air, but directly inside her skull. "You looked away. You were supposed to be the responsible one. And you looked away." This was a new and profound level of horror. The memory was no longer a source of guilt that she felt. It had become an active, accusatory entity. A hostile presence living inside her. The grief she had carried for 14 years had curdled into monstrosity. The ghost of Lily, the phantom she had tried to protect and mourn, had been twisted by the unnatural void into her personal tormentor. It was the ultimate violation for an archivist. Her primary source, the most important document in her entire life, had been corrupted. It was no longer a record of what happened. It was a weapon forged from her own pain, designed to destroy her from within. The guilt was no longer a feeling. It was a verdict handed down by a judge who wore her sister's face. The psychic agony was immense. The chorus of stolen traumas in the room, and the sharp, piercing voice of the ghost in her own machine. It was too much. A sound tore from her throat, a choked, ragged gasp, half sob, half scream. The sound, tiny as it was, shattered the silence of the gallery. Julian's beatific smile vanished. His head snapped in her direction, his eyes instantly locking onto her hiding spot. The calm, detached curator was gone, replaced by the cold, lethal focus of a predator whose sanctuary had been invaded. He took a step towards her. But in that same instant, the psychic feedback loop seemed to affect him too. Her scream of terror, amplified by the resonant frequency of the room, had momentarily disrupted his control. The objects seemed to pulse, their silent screams rising in pitch, a cacophony of his own curated collection turning on him. His face contorted in a brief flash of pain, his focus breaking for a split second. It was all the time she needed. Acting on pure, animal instinct, Ilara lunged forward. She didn't run for the door. She shoved the pedestal in front of her with all her strength. The antique birdcage toppled, crashing to the concrete floor with a discordant clang that echoed like a gunshot. While Julian was momentarily distracted by the desecration of his art, Ilara bolted. She slammed her hand against the panel, and the heavy door hissed open. She threw herself into the sterile hallway and ran, her footsteps echoing a frantic, desperate rhythm. She was not just fleeing the monster in the room. She was fleeing the far more terrifying ghost that was now wide awake and screaming inside her own head. Ilara didn't go home. Home was no longer safe, it was just another stage for the ghost in her head. There was only one place she could go, the only fortress she had ever known. She drove through the deserted pre-dawn streets to the municipal archives, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. Inside, surrounded by the silent, sleeping history of a million other lives, she felt a fragile sliver of control return. This was her domain. A place of facts, of tangible records, of memories that could be held and verified. It was the antithesis of the nightmare unfolding in her skull. She barricaded the door to her small, windowless office in the sub-basement and collapsed into her chair, the cool, dry air a thin balm on her terror. But there was no escape. The ghost of Lily was with her, a constant, whispering presence in the quiet. "You ran," it hissed in her thoughts, its voice a venomous echo of her sister's. "Just like you always do. You left me in the car then, you left me in that room now. You always leave me." The accusations were a relentless, psychological torture, twisting the knife of her guilt deeper and deeper. She didn't know how long she sat there, a prisoner in her own sanctuary, but when she finally looked up from her desk, he was there. Julian wasn't standing in the doorway. He was simply in the room, leaning against a tall filing cabinet as if he had been there for hours. The barricade on the door was untouched. The building's state-of-the-art security had been nothing to him. He looked calm, unhurried, his suit immaculate. The only sign of their earlier encounter was a small, dark smudge of dust on his sleeve from the fallen pedestal. "That was a very expensive piece of curation you destroyed," he said, his voice level, conversational. The despair of a failed architect. Very rare. A surge of pure, hot rage burned through Ilara's fear. "You have to fix it," she snarled, rising from her chair, her voice a raw, ragged thing. "You have to put it back. The memory. The one you took." "Ah," Julian said, a look of genuine fascination on his face. He took a step closer. "Yes, the void. It seems to be having a rather dramatic effect on your foundational archives. Tell me about it." The ghost. Is she vivid? His clinical curiosity was more monstrous than any threat. He wasn't angry. He was a scientist observing an unexpected and delightful result from his experiment. She's a monster, Ilara spat. You made her a monster. I didn't make anything, he corrected gently. I simply created a vacuum. Nature, as they say, abhors it. Your mind is desperately trying to fill the hole I made with the most powerful material it has. Your trauma. But the void corrupts it. It taints the data. A fascinating, if somewhat volatile, side effect. He paused, studying her as if she were a priceless, unstable artifact. But I can see it's distressing for you. And I am, despite your recent destructive behavior, a man of my word. I offered you a solution to your pain. This is merely a complication. I can resolve it. Then do it, she pleaded, the rage in her voice cracking with desperation. Reverse it. It cannot be reversed, he said simply. A memory once deaccessioned cannot be reinstalled. The original file is in my possession. But I can offer you a permanent solution. A final procedure. He circled her desk slowly, his presence sucking the very air from the room. The ghost tortures you because she is anchored to the memory of the accident. The pain, the guilt, the love, it's all the same chaotic energy signature. As long as that memory exists, the ghost will have a place to live. So I will make you a final offer. A collector's choice, if you will. He stopped directly in front of her, his gaze intense, pinning her in place. Option A, he began, his voice dropping to a hypnotic whisper. I take it all. The memory of your sister. Not just the crash. Every birthday party, every argument, every secret you shared. The sound of her laugh, the image of her face. I will unarchive Lily completely and permanently. The ghost will vanish because its source code will be gone. The guilt will be gone. The pain will be gone. There will be a much larger quiet inside you, but it will be absolute. You will be free. The thought was both horrifying and seductively beautiful. A life without the weight. A life of silence. Or, Julian continued, his voice hardening slightly, option B. You can keep her. You can walk out of this building and live with the thing you've created in your head. You can spend the rest of your life with that venomous, accusatory ghost as your constant companion. You can let her whisper in your ear every single day, reminding you of your failure, poisoning every new memory you ever make. You can live in your own private, perfectly tailored hell. Ilara stared at him, the two choices hanging in the air, each one a different kind of damnation. Why? She whispered. Why give me a choice at all? A thin, cold smile touched his lips. Because that is the art of it. The collection requires a degree of consent. A forced removal damages the artifact, you see. It taints the flavor. Your agreement to the first procedure gave me a foothold in your archive. But a foundational memory, one as powerful as your sister. I need you to be willing to let her go. I need you to hand her to me. He was a monster, but a monster with rules. The most exquisitely cruel rules imaginable. The ghost in her mind screamed. Make it stop, Ilara. He can make it stop. Let me go. Let me be quiet. It was a siren song of self-destruction, her own corrupted grief begging for its own annihilation. Julian stood before her, patient, expectant. The curator waiting for her to choose which masterpiece she would donate to his collection. The perfect, tragic memory of a beloved sister, or the rest of her own tormented life. The silence in the sub-basement office was absolute, a dead space between two impossible choices. Ilara stood before Julian, feeling the immense gravitational pull of his offer. The quiet. The end of the pain. It was a promise of cool water to a woman dying of thirst. The ghost in her mind clawed at her resolve, its whispers turning into a desperate, seductive plea. Let him do it, Ilara. Let me go. It hurts. It hurts so much. Just let me be quiet. Let me rest. It was the voice of her own grief, twisted into an instrument of self-destruction. And she was so tired. So tired of the weight, the endless loop of the crash, the suffocating presence of a 14-year-old phantom. Her will began to erode. To hand it all over, to let him take the burden she had carried for half her life. It felt less like a surrender and more like a salvation. She looked at Julian's patient, expectant face and she opened her mouth to say yes. But as she did, another memory surfaced. Not the trauma, but a small, quiet moment from years before the accident. Lily, maybe 9 years old, with a gap-toothed grin, showing Ilara a jar with a firefly inside. Ilara, the budding archivist, had explained that the firefly would die if they kept it. She remembered the look on Lily's face as they let it go, a mixture of sadness and wonder as the tiny light blinked and disappeared into the twilight. The memory was simple, mundane, and it was inextricably woven into the fabric of the girl who would die in a car wreck years later. In that instant, Elara understood. The grief and the guilt were not separate from the love, they were its shadow. The pain was the echo of the joy. To erase the trauma of Lily's death would be to erase the firefly in the jar. It would be to render her entire existence, her entire meaning in Elara's life, a blank page. The quiet Julian offered wasn't peace, it was annihilation. It was the ultimate betrayal. The memory, even this new, corrupted, monstrous version of it, was the last thing she had. It was the proof that Lily had lived, had laughed, had mattered. The pain was the price of the love, and it was a price she finally realized she had to be willing to pay. She raised her head, the conflict in her eyes hardening into a final, defiant resolve. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady. The ghost in her mind let out a silent, agonized scream. Julian's eyebrow twitched, the first crack in his serene facade. "No," he repeated. "She's mine," Elara said, the words feeling like anchors, holding her to the bedrock of her own soul. "The love is mine. The pain is mine. The guilt is mine. You can't have her. You can't have any of it." It was not a plea. It was a verdict. For a moment, Julian's expression remained blank. Then something shifted behind his eyes. The detached, curious artist vanished, and in its place was a cold, reptilian fury. It wasn't the hot rage of a thwarted man. It was the incensed, absolute wrath of a god whose divine aesthetic had been rejected by a mortal. "You sentimental fool," he hissed, the words dripping with a venomous contempt. "You cling to your flawed, corrupted data as if it were sacred. You choose to live in a broken archive." He took a step closer, his face a mask of cold fury. "You're right. The memory is yours. And an archivist, above all, should have the most accurate records. Your recollection is incomplete, muddled by grief. Let me correct it for you." Before Elara could react, he moved. His hand lashed out, not with the force of a blow, but with an impossible surgical speed. Two fingers, cold as frozen steel, pressed against her right temple. There was no hum, no disorienting questions. There was only a blinding, searing jolt of pure, white-hot information being rammed directly into her brain. It was not an extraction. It was an injection. A malicious, forced-right command on the source code of her soul. The world dissolved. She was 17 again, in the car, in the rain. The argument with Lily. The pop song. The wipers. Everything was the same, but rendered in a new, hyper-realistic detail. She could feel the dampness of her jeans, the faint vibration of the engine through the steering wheel. Lily leaned over from the passenger seat, her face a mask of teenage fury. "I hate you," she seethed. And in that instant, a new feeling bloomed in Elara's chest. A flash of pure, white-hot rage, a disgusting, possessive anger at this child who was ruining everything. And in the new, perfect, high-fidelity memory that Julian was authoring, her hands, guided by that flash of rage, turned the wheel. It was a minuscule movement. A twitch. A barely perceptible, deliberate jerk towards the glare of the oncoming headlights. It wasn't an accident caused by distraction. It was an impulse acted upon. It was a micro-attentive murder. The crash that followed was the same. The screech of tires. The shattering glass. The terrible, final silence. But the context was forever changed. The rational part of her mind, the archivist buried deep inside, screamed that it was a lie, a false memory implanted by a monster. But the feeling, the memory felt more real, more true than the original ever had. The guilt was no longer a vague, shapeless burden of responsibility. It was a sharp, specific, and undeniable fact. She had done it. Julian removed his fingers. The vision snapped, leaving her on her knees on the cold linoleum floor of the office, gasping, choking on a sob that was too profound for sound. He looked down at her, his composure completely restored. On his face was a faint, cruel smile of artistic satisfaction. "There," he said softly, his voice once again calm and clinical. "A more complete record. Now you can truly remember her." He turned and walked towards the door, his footsteps silent. He left her there, not hollowed out, but filled to the brim with a new, perfect, and eternal agony. He hadn't taken her most precious memory. He had taken it, twisted it into a masterpiece of psychological torment, and locked her inside it forever. Julian was gone. In the weeks and months that followed that final horrific encounter in the archive sub-basement, Elara found no trace of him. The storage facility unit was empty, the minimalist pedestals and their terrible burdens vanished. The Shell Corporation was a digital ghost. It was as if he had been a phantom, a figment of her imagination. But the scar he'd left behind, the masterpiece he had authored inside her head, was terrifyingly real. On the surface, Ilara's life resumed its quiet, orderly rhythm. She went to work each day. She cataloged artifacts, repaired bindings, and fought the eternal battle against humidity. Her work, if anything, became even more meticulous, her focus on the tangible histories of others a desperate, all-consuming shield. Her colleagues noted that she had grown quieter, more withdrawn, a sad, solitary figure who moved through the stacks like a ghost. They kept their distance, sensing a sorrow too deep and too strange to approach. But the real story was inside. The true horror was the silence. The malevolent, whispering ghost of her sister was gone. Julian's final, terrible gift had been to erase that tormentor. But what he had replaced it with was infinitely worse. The corrected memory of the accident was no longer an intrusive flashback that ambushed her in moments of quiet. It had become the foundation of her reality, the constant, ambient hum beneath every waking moment. She lived in two timelines simultaneously. In one, she was a woman in her early 30s, carefully handling a 19th century land grant. In the other, it was always a rainy night. She was always 17, her hands on a steering wheel. The radio was always playing a distorted pop song. And her sister was always in the passenger seat, her mouth forming the words, "I hate you." The loop was seamless, unbreakable. The faint, phantom sound of rain on glass was a permanent feature of her hearing, a quiet static she could hear even in the sunniest of days. Sometimes, the dry, papery scent of the archive would be overpowered for a moment by the phantom smell of gasoline and wet upholstery. She would look down at her hands, carefully documenting a piece of history, and see not the archivist's fingers, but the white-knuckled grip of a teenage girl. The memory was no longer just a memory. It was the operating system of her consciousness. And in its new, perfected form, the guilt was absolute. There was no ambiguity, no room for the solace of an accident. There was only the hot, shameful flash of rage, and the tiny, deliberate, world-ending twitch of the steering wheel. That single, fabricated moment was now the most real thing about her. Her work, once her sanctuary, had become a special kind of hell. She was the curator of a million objective truths, the guardian of verifiable histories, while her own primary document, the cornerstone of her soul, was a malicious forgery she was forced to accept as fact. She was an archivist whose own archive was a lie. And Lily. In the new memory, Lily was forever silent after the impact. Her expression in that last, frozen moment was not one of surprise or pain. It was a look of quiet, knowing betrayal, an eternal, unchanging monument to Ilara's unforgivable sin. It was an accusation that never had to be spoken because it never, ever ended. Tonight, she works late. The archive is silent and still. She sits at her desk, a single pool of lamplight illuminating the delicate, spidery handwriting on a letter from 1888. She should be analyzing the ink, the paper, the script. But she isn't seeing it. Her eyes are unfocused, looking past the letter, past the desk, past the century between then and now. Her breathing is shallow. The quiet hum of the building's climate control has become the sound of tires on wet asphalt. A familiar, hot flash of rage blooms in her chest, a phantom limb of an emotion. Her right hand, resting on the desk beside the letter, makes a tiny, infinitesimal twitch. The loop begins again. It will always begin again. Far away in another city, the collector may one day think of her. He has other pieces now, other perfect moments of agony stored in mundane objects on clean, white shelves. But she is different. She is special. She is not a memory stored in an object. She is a memory walking in the world. A living, breathing, mobile exhibit of a single, exquisitely crafted moment of eternal torment. She is his masterpiece,